Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley and I'm the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer at the Training Accreditation Council, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the last part in the internal audit series and I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk Noongar people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. A recording of this session and handouts will be available on the TAC website wa.gov.au/TAC, and certificates of attendance and a survey will be also provided in the next few days. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our presenter for today. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Mel, and good morning, everyone. There are a lot of very familiar names on the list, so we're very pleased to see you back again with us for, as Mel said, this final session. There are also a few names on the list that I don't recognise. For those of you who might be joining for the first time in this session, the two previous sessions, the recordings and handouts are all available from the TAC's website, so you're able to go back and have a look at those sessions as well. So today in session 3, we are really doing those or talking about those things that round out the internal audit process. In session 1, we talked about all of the planning and logistics things that we might do for an audit. In session 2, we talked about how to actually conduct the audit, and our session today is focused on how we might report our findings out of an audit, how to negotiate rectifications with the people that we have audited, timeframes and follow-up and the things that you need to consider there, how you might close out an audit, and again touching on that focus on continuous improvement. So you are going to need the handout that we have provided for today's session, because there's a couple of activities that will actually require you to use that handout. So again, I want to stress, as Mel has said, please ask any questions that you might want to ask using the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them all today. Okay. So after we have conducted an audit, generally we are going to write a report of some kind. Doesn't matter whether it's an internal audit or an external audit. And so I guess I have a question really for you, is how many times have you read an audit report, and I'm going to include myself in this as well, and you've been left scratching your head and thinking, I'm not really sure what this report is telling me. That's really not what we want. The audit report is such an important document for the people who have been involved in an audit. It needs to be really clear, consistent, accurate, and it has to be understandable for the audience that it's being provided to. When it comes to external audits, we have a very set way that we have to report, but in an internal audit, you have got scope to write the reports in a way that's going to best suit your organisation. And generally, what happens is if you write a novel, people struggle to read it. So think about ways that might work for your organisation. So you might find, for example, that you have multiple reports. There might be, or you might be an organisation that has a board, and there has to be some kind of short, sharp briefing to a board. But the audit team, the people who have been audited, they might need some more information. When you think about an audit report, it doesn't necessarily have to be a written document. Why can't we do a presentation? The answer is we can. So there are lots and lots of ways that you could structure an audit report so that it is useful for the people in your organisation. The main thing is that you make sure that it's used and it's useful. And so when we are reporting audit findings, typically there's 4 things that we will report. 3 of them sit on this slide. So compliance is the easiest of all. When we are reporting compliance, we will say that you have demonstrated compliance with a clause. So that's the simplest one. The next is an opportunity for improvement. And remember, when we are reporting an opportunity for improvement, we're saying that you are compliant and we have a suggestion for you. So for me, I always start my opportunities for improvement with "it is suggested," because that is all it is. It's a suggestion to the RTO that they can take or leave when they think about how it might work for them. So this is an opportunity for improvement that has been written around the case study that we have used for the previous two sessions. So we might say it's suggested that the trainers and assessors are provided with a brief at the next trainers meeting explaining transition options for students between course streams. So nice and simple and just focused on what it is that you want the RTO to think about. Another option that we have is reporting good practice. And when we talk about good practice, we're talking about things that the RTO does above and beyond what would normally be expected. So again, in the example that we have got here, it's based on the case study we have used throughout this series. So we're saying the course-specific information night and the learner follow-up is a very effective way of providing learners with detailed information in an accessible manner. The information night also provides the opportunity for the RTO to begin building relationships with the learners and the cohort to form. Learners interviewed as part of the audit all stressed the value that this early relationship building had on their learning journey. So we are saying very, very clearly what it is that is happening and what the impact of those actions are. And of course, in good practice, it's going to be what the benefit of those actions are. So in essence, we're explaining why it is that we think that it is outstanding. So when we write audit reports, these are the three outcomes that we all enjoy writing. And there is one more that we have to talk about, and that is when things are not going quite as we would want them to, and we might have to report a non-compliance. So what you have got here is a framework that you could use to report non-compliances, and it structures things very, very clearly, and we'll have a go at using it in a minute. But fundamentally, there's four things that you need to write. The first of that is what is the requirement of the standard, and we would suggest that you restate the clause in very simple terms. The second thing is what did you see in the evidence? So this is where you might list the evidence and explain what you saw. So you're not making a judgment at this point. You're just saying this is what the standard required. This is what we saw when we did the audit. The third part of this framework is to actually explain what the gap is. So what is the gap between the evidence and the requirement of the standard? And this is the really important part, because this is where you are providing information to the people who are going to receive this audit report so that they can say, oh yeah, I understand what that problem is. And the fourth part of that is that you will say to the RTO what you want them to do about it. Now, in an external audit, we don't tell you what to do. We will say something very generic like, the RTO is to provide evidence to show compliance with this clause. So we don't tell you what you have to do. But in an internal audit, this is where you can actually provide specific advice about how you might want the RTO to actually address whatever it is that's the problem within what they're doing. So this framework, like once you actually get used to using it, it's a very, very quick way of structuring, writing non-compliances so that it is very, very easy for the people who are reading the report to understand what it is they need to do. So now it's your turn to try it. So we've got an activity for you. So again, you are going to need your handout. You have got the case study sitting on page 3 of your handout, and the space for you to write notes is on page 7 of your handout. And what we want you to do is to write a non-compliance for a community RTO, for that community RTO case study. Now, when we talked about this last week and we looked at the issues, we decided that we would probably write it as an opportunity for improvement because this had impacted one person in 100. It was an isolated incident. So let's turn that around and say that it isn't an isolated incident. When you look at the 100 enrolments that have been across this organisation, 20 people have been impacted by this not being able to change between the streams after they have commenced. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to think about how you would write this non-compliance using the framework that we have just talked about. Draft it on your notes, and then when you're happy with the way you have written your non-compliance, we want you to paste that into the chat box. It's 12 minutes past 10 now, so that brings us back at 17 minutes past 10. I'm going to turn the camera and microphone off at my end, but I will be sitting here watching the chat box for your responses and any questions that you might have about the activity. So write a non-compliance, pop your compliance in the chat box, and we will be back at 10:17. Okay. So we have a number of examples in there, and Leslie, I agree with you that it can sometimes take a long time to craft these non-compliances, especially if you feel that they sit across multiple clauses, as Jo has identified in her response. So we're all picking up on the concept that we have got to provide accurate, accessible information so people can make a good choice about enrolling with the RTO, and the fact that when we looked at the evidence that was provided, we didn't have enough detailed information to make a decision. So what that means, as you have identified, is that the students didn't know everything that they needed to know to make a decision about the RTO, and the RTO needs to make some changes around that, and that ranges from providing more information to the candidates about the course, but it might also include different information sitting in the marketing, or it might also include providing more information to the trainers and assessors as well. Okay, so while we are all on the same track, we have all written it in quite different ways. I'll show you how I wrote it. Okay, so part 1 of that framework. Standard requires that the RTO provide current, accurate information that enables the learner to make an informed decision about undertaking training with the RTO. That's my restatement of the clause. Then I will say what evidence I saw. The RTO uses a course information sheet, an interview, and information night to provide information to prospective learners. So all I have said there is these are the things that I saw and looked at, have made any judgment about whether there's a gap or not. The information that's in purple on the screen in front of you is the bit where we would describe the gap. So the information provided addresses the minimum requirements set out in clause 5.2, but does not include information about the limitations of moving between course streams after the commencement of training. The lack of information about moving between streams means that the learner is not able to make an informed decision about which stream to enrol in, resulting in the RTO being non-compliant. So it's really important that we try and get that part right, and it can take quite some time to craft a succinct statement that everyone's going to be able to understand. And last week when we were talking about this, and we talked about exit meetings and having to tell the RTO that they had some non-compliances, some of this crafting basically has to be done by the time you're telling people that there is a non-compliance that they might need to address. And so we also talked about giving ourselves time to think and gather our thoughts and think about how we're going to explain things to people. And this little exercise of just giving you 5 minutes to think about one little bit hopefully has brought home that in fact you might actually need an hour or so at least to think about what you might want to say to people in an exit briefing. Now, the last sentence in this is the bit that you typically don't get in an external audit. This is where we give you very generic information, where we ask you to provide evidence that meets the requirements of the clause. Here you can actually say what you want done. So in this case, the RTO is to update the learner information to provide clear advice about transferring between course streams after the commencement of training. So we have some very specific things that we want done. So when you think about non-compliances in this way, when you use a framework like this, it can also help you decide if you're looking at a non-compliance or if it's an opportunity for improvement. If you can't clearly write the non-compliance in this kind of framework, then there's probably one of two options available to you. The first is it's not a non-compliance. If you can't express it in this way, there's something wrong. The other thing is your gut feeling might be saying this is definitely a non-compliance, in which case you probably don't have enough evidence to write it in this way. So you might need to go and collect some more evidence to help you decide whether what you're looking at is non-compliance and you can write it in this way, or maybe it's actually an opportunity for improvement. So generally we find using these kinds of frameworks is really helpful in report writing, not only for a small organisation, because remember this all might be a one-person organisation, it might be a two-person, it might be a five-person, it might be a big organisation like a TAFE. If you have multiple auditors and you're lucky enough to have that, then it also provides a framework for some consistency between audit reports that people might see. So there's a lot of benefit for using this type of approach when you're writing audit reports. So once you've got this thing written, whether it be a bigger report, whether it be in a presentation, however it is you're going to present it, you've got to think about what you're going to do with it then. So there's generally some actions that we will always take. They're things such as you have to distribute a draft report. In most internal audits, a draft report will go to the people who have been audited so that they have an opportunity to have a look at it and say, yes, that's accurate, that's what happened in the audit, and it can be finalised then. You would discuss with the team any actions that are required. You would have some kind of agreement and endorsement of the final report and action plan. Often in an internal audit, there's a draft action plan attached. You will follow up to check the progress of those actions. And when everything's completed, you're going to finalise the report. So the issuing of the report is not the end of your job as the auditor. So we'll talk through each of these in a little bit more detail. Starting with distributing the audit report, deciding who gets the report. So typically the legally responsible person will always have a copy of the audit report. The quality team in an organisation, sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's a team. The manager or the supervisor in the area that's actually been audited will have a copy of the audit report, and the team that has been audited will also typically have a copy of the audit report. So, I stress again, depending upon the size of your organisation, if you have a very small organisation, this just might be one person's notes. If you're in a bigger organisation, the reports tend to become more formal the bigger that you get. So when we have that draft audit report, we often have a draft action plan that goes with it. And when we're writing that in internal audit situations, it's most effective if we put that action plan together with the team that has been audited. Now, they can take many, many different formats, and there is no requirement to have one particular format for an action plan. The most common problem that we see with action plans, and it doesn't matter whether it comes out of an internal audit, we often have the same issues coming out of validation activities. The issue that we see is we don't track the actions through to completion and to see if they're effective. So we will often see action plans that have been drafted and agreed to, and then we'll say, what's been done? And when you have a look at what's been done, no one can answer that question. And you would have to go and talk to 4 or 5 different people to see if the plan has been actioned. Now, that is not hugely efficient in an organisation or effective. So this next slide is an example of how an action plan might look. And again, there is no set format. You've got a copy of this in your handout. You can adapt it, use it if you like. So it's really a very simple template, and it's quite effective because it's got all the bits in it that we need. So if we talk about each of these columns, so first of all, we have a priority column. Now, the idea is that we use the priority to decide which things we have to deal with first, what is likely to have the most impact on our organisation. And when I'm thinking about this, I always talk about them as showstoppers. Like if we had an external audit tomorrow, what of these things would cause us significant non-compliance or stop the show? And so those are the things that we would address first, typically. When we do that, it also gives us an opportunity to make it a little less overwhelming. So, for example, there might be 10 actions and you're looking at it and thinking about your calendar and going, how on earth am I going to do all of these things? If they're prioritised, you only have to focus on number 1 first. So we do that first and then move to the others. So there's some real benefits to prioritising what it is you do. I also like to group ones that are related. So for example, I might have a priority 1 action that has got 2 other actions listed in the plan that are related in some way, and I would just colour code those so that I could see and consider those things possibly together. Then you have a column to write the actions in, so these are the things that people need to do. And in this case, I would suggest to you that the best thing that you can do here is to actually be specific. Some examples of things that I might typically see is I'll see something in the action which says review the assessment. Okay. So if I'm the person that is receiving this action plan and I'm looking at it and it says review the assessment, I still really don't know what it is I have to do. But if I said something like review a knowledge assessment 1 to include a scenario task that requires the learner to draft an incident report for a first aid incident, then I have got some really specific actions that the person responsible for it, me, can go, oh, that's what I need to do. And I don't have to go through a whole diagnosis bit again to get to what it is I need to do. So typically the more specific those actions are, the more useful the plan is. we are going to allocate those actions to a person who's responsible for completing them, and we're going to set a due date on them. So human nature is simply that if there's no due date, if there's no deadline, we just push it out. If we put a due date on it, then we have, in essence, created a boundary, and most of us work quite well within boundaries. So put a due date on it, a realistic one. Status gives you an opportunity to say how you're going with things. So I might be able to, I might be the manager of this area, I might look at this action plan and I can see that 3 of the 7 have commenced and 1 is delayed. So the one that is delayed, I can go through and I can have a look at it and say, why has this been delayed? And what can I do to, help move that forward? So having a status there is a really simple way of, checking progress. And I use things like commenced, delayed, on track, or completed when I'm doing my action plans. And the comments section is really for you to provide information. So you might have had an action to update the assessment, but you might have picked up some other things as well in doing that. So I would write that in the comments section. If it was delayed, I might write in there what was being delayed, or why it was being delayed and what actions have been taken as a result of that. This is the contextual stuff that will actually help you as an organisation. So the really important thing here is to know that these documents, these action plans, are living documents, and we need to use them continuously in our organisations to make sure that we are actually implementing the improvements that we have found through internal audit or any other review type activity that we might be undertaking. Now, when we're thinking about our to-do list, our action plan, it's important to think about a few things, or other things in finalising that. So priorities are the first thing, address any showstoppers first. And then the next 2 dot points on this slide are really important in determining what you actually need to address the non-compliance or the opportunity for improvement. So you've got to think about the capability of the team or the people. So have we got the right people to actually carry out those actions? And if we do have the right people, have they got availability to do it? So what have they already got on their plates? And when we add these actions on top, are their plates going to overflow? Because we have to take care of the people in our team. We have that obligation. So asking those 2 questions about capability and availability help us figure out what a reasonable time frame is for completion, and do we need to put any additional resources in place to actually make sure that those actions can be completed. The fundamental thing is that we don't want an action plan that in fact can't be done, and that is discouraging to the people who are going to be implementing any changes. We want it to be realistic and encouraging for them. And then the final thing that we have to think about is following up to track progress. Like who's going to do that follow-up? Typically the auditor. How often are you going to do that follow-up? What's that follow-up going to look like? Is it going to be a phone call? Is it going to be an email? Are you going to wander around and sit and chat about, how things are going? How are you going to track that? And what can you do to actually help any barriers or remove any barriers that are in place to for those people not being able to achieve the actions? So your role as the auditor typically goes a lot further than actually just conducting that audit. It's about helping this process also happen within the organisation. So these are all the kinds of notes that you could put in the action plan in the comments section. And in bigger organisation, a lot of these action plans sit in Excel documents, and that is primarily because they can sort on those. So you could sort on the person responsible, you can sort on the due dates, and you can, I guess, focus your efforts, your follow-up efforts when you're doing that. And of course, if you happen to be lucky enough to be using some of the project management software that's out there, that's actually very, very accessible these days, then those tools also allow you to manipulate that information, the data, and to track what's going on. So very, very early on in session 1, we did talk about the fact that we would like the people who are our auditors to be good at managing data, and this is part of the reason why, because you will actually need to follow up and use tools that are available to help you with that. So eventually you're going to get to a point where everything that is sitting on those action plans is actually being actioned. And this is a point that we would say we are ready to close out the audit. So this happens when all of the actions have been completed, been implemented. And there's a few important things for you to think about here. So firstly is this audit report and the action plan is to store those for future reference. Now, I can't actually tell you the number of times that we look at something in an RTO, and I'll say to the RTO, oh, that's interesting. Why did you do that? And they can't answer that. And that is because the knowledge around why particular actions were taken is lost with the people that walk out the door from the organisation in that constant churn of staff. And so storing the audit reports and the action plans and them having enough information in it is actually a really important strategy or part of the knowledge management that sits in an organisation. And as you know, I've already mentioned, those documents, they provide a whole lot of contextual information around decisions that have been made in the organisation, and they're important not only now but into the future when we look at why we have done particular things. So we've done all the actions, we've stored everything that we need to store and keep, and the other thing that we might then do is we might update any audit schedule that exists for us in the organisation. And so there might be things that have been implemented as part of the action plan that you want to check again in 6 months or 12 months because you need to see that those things are working. And so you would reprogram the same qualifications or units into your audit schedule for that later date. It might be that in the process of having a look at how things needed to change in the organisation, you've identified some more risks for the organisation, and so you again might tweak your audit schedule to make sure that you're picking up on all of those risks that you've identified throughout the process. So often what you're going to find is that the actions from your audit will then impact your future audit schedule. And, you know, we talked about it at the start of the session that these schedules are living documents. Same with your validation schedule, any other review schedule. They need to respond to the information that you are getting in your organisation that tells you, oh, there's a risk here, let's go and have a look at it, or there's an opportunity here for us, let's go and have a look at it. And I guess that leads us to, in fact, you know, many of the reasons why we do internal audit, and that is focusing on continuous improvement. So continuous improvement is really the basis of our entire regulation. It's all about putting a plan in place, testing if it works, and improving what we do as we go. So a really important question for you to ask yourselves is, what have we learned from this audit process that could provide opportunities for our organisation now, but also into the future? What weaknesses did the audit process identify, and we now need to work on those things as an organisation. And at some point further on, maybe 3 to 6 months later, depending upon the types of changes that you have been implementing, did the rectifications work as we expected them to? And I've seen this many times, and I'm sure you have seen it as well. You will put things in place in an organisation with the absolute intent that it's going to work beautifully for the organisation, and it doesn't always work beautifully. So go and have a look. Did it work as we intended? If it didn't, what else do we need to do to make sure that the rectifications we've put in place are effective? So this kind of questioning of what we do, and it's reflective questioning, is something that you really want to build into everything that you do. So these kinds of questions, not only are we thinking about them at the end of the audit process, these are the kinds of questions that we should be thinking about throughout the audit process as well. And ideally, you will build these things into every process in your organisation. So while it can sound extremely cliched, quality it's not a destination. It's actually an ongoing journey. It's something that you do all of the time. Internal audits are just one way of collecting information that you can use to actually inform that journey in your organisation. They can be, if we're not doing it well, simply a compliance check at a point in time. If we are doing them well, they're going to be activities that actually provide you with lots of useful information that you can use in your organisation to improve what it is you do, to improve the quality of the outcomes for your students and for industry and community. So internal audits can be incredibly valuable when we do them well. So we have had 3 sessions now where we have looked at how this process might function in our organisations. And in the spirit of this slide, it's now time for us to ask you to reflect on what it is you have taken from these 3 sessions. So what we want you to do is to reflect on the discussions over the 3 webinars and think about what actions you could take in your RTO to improve outcomes for your organisation and its learners. And if you feel comfortable, what we want you to do is to pop those answers into the chat box. We want to give you 5 minutes to do that. Again, I'm going to turn the camera and the microphone off, but I will be here watching for any questions that you might have. Michelle, you're already on the ball. Thank you. So it's 10:46 by my clock. So we will come back just after 10:02 to talk about your responses. Okay, there are some great comments in there about what you might take away for your organisations, and there's some really clear themes coming through in what you have said. Being systematic about it, making sure the processes are in place, making sure everything is clear and understandable, working with the people that you are going to audit, making sure that you follow up on actions. That's exactly what we wanted to see. So thank you so much for putting those comments there, and I'm really looking forward. So some of the names in there are people that I tend to visit for external audits as well as some internal work, so I'm really looking forward to seeing these things in place in your organisations. And I also want to remind you that with the handouts that came with this session of webinars, there's also a really detailed fact sheet that can support what it is that we have talked about over the 3 sessions. So this is the first time we have run this series of workshops, and we are very keen to get any feedback from you about things that you think we can improve in the way that we have run the sessions. I'm just trying to see who said they're going to watch the webinars again, but of course the webinars will also be available on TAC's website if you wanted to go back and have another look. There's a lot of other resources that are available to you to help inform what you do in internal audits in the other aspects of our regulatory standards. So TAC has a whole series of podcasts and a whole series of fact sheets that are available to you to help you think about how things are working within your organisations. So I would like to thank you all for coming today and for the previous 2 sessions. I'm really pleased to see that so many of you came back. That's wonderful. And wish you all the best in your RTOs, in implementing your internal audit programs, and no doubt we'll see you again soon in another learning opportunity. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.